seventh edition of this symposium in the Literary Activism series, which began in, the first one happened in December 2014 here in Calcutta, where I am at the moment. And, there was no kind of, we didn't even know what Zoom was at that time, and wouldn't for a few years to come. So there wasn't even any question of there being sort of hybrid sessions. What we had was nevertheless a kind of international symposium where people flew over to Calcutta from other parts of the world, and there were, of course, people from Calcutta and other parts of India who were speakers at that symposium. And that symposium was simply called Literary Activism. That was the theme. And then we kind of branched off into different concerns and ideas which might be addressed under this rubric. The series is called Literary Activism. It kind of covers any sort of creative and critical practice. So it's not just literature or writing. So we've had as speakers filmmakers, translators, people from various kind of who work in various genres and practices. As I've said before, wanted a space where people could talk about concerns or issues which weren't getting maybe, which would have, say, had a space, had a kind of space within which they could be discussed, had such spaces existed where, artists and writers and filmmakers got together to discuss, for instance, their kind of view on non-narrative cinema or non-narrative sort of writing, just to kind of pluck an example out of the air. But these kind of these preoccupations were not getting addressed by academia or academic conferences. They weren't getting addressed in literary festivals. That kind of conversation wasn't happening. So it was to create a space for that sort of conversation that this particular symposium, a series of symposia was created. And today's conversation and tomorrow's is about what also has bothered me for years, or what I've thought about or puzzled over for years, and that has to do with the elision of the modern and of modernity, its offshoots. And I suppose the kind of conversation that I'm talking about itself is a feature of modernity. So, we're talking about a certain kind of elisions, and we'll try and figure out what's behind those illusions. I'm very glad to have had the support of Ashoka University, where I now teach. The symposium series was begun with the university when I was with the University of East Anglia, and since 2018, Ashoka University has been has been the main partner and then the main host. And now, with the instituting of the newly formed Center for the Creative and the Critical, it's wonderful to have a particular institutional framework and context in which one can do things which are sort of at an angle to the institution. So that's where we are, and that's what we're doing and what we hope to do for some years to come. And we also have a website, literaryactivism.com, which started last August. Again, this followed my move to Ashoka. So I'm very glad that about the role that Ashoka is playing over here. Professor Shoikat Majumdar is the head of Department of Creative Writing at Ashoka University. And I'd like him to say a few words and then we can begin.
Sure. Thank you, Amita, and thank you for all of you being here. It's a fairly comfortable time for us in the New Delhi area at, 4 quarter to 5. But with apologies for all of you for whom this is a very ungodly hour. But we are really happy to welcome you here. And when Amita told me that the subject is going to be about modernity and modernism, it really thrilled me personally, greatly, because it's a subject which I've thought about for a long time as someone who primarily works in prose, who has a abiding interest in genres like the novel and the short story. I think the questions of modernity are inescapable. Obviously, as we all know that, in a way, institutions of Western modernity made these genres possible, and as such, in what sense they are problematically possible for writers from different parts of the world has been an abiding concern of me. And I've also been very interested in some of the themes, I think that comes up in our mind whenever we talk about modernism, whether it's the modern cityscape, Flannery, everyday life, even structures of bureaucracy and boredom. And I have written about many of these things in my fiction, in my criticism. They keep appearing. So it's really very much all around us. And of late, I've also been very fascinated by the genres of performance, like someone like Amit is a singer, and I, as someone who works in prose, but how many of these genres of performance predate modernity, things like poetry, theater, performance, obviously go beyond modernity. And that has also started to fascinate me, that what lies, maybe before modernity, past modernity. And I think those are the conversations that we are going to sort of see gather in over this weekend. I'm very intrigued by the title, also not mentioning the modern. And I think in many ways I've been thinking a lot about what this signifies, and it's impossible to not imagine the tremendous amount of violence that modernity has also involved. Obviously, in our parts of the world, that violence is immediately synonymous with colonialism, the kind of violence that has led to, especially British and French colonialism. Obviously, we are right in the middle of a military violence that's happening right now, and many of these violences, territorial violences, can be traced back to modernity and its aftermath. And it's also the various social, anthropological, technological, and very importantly, sort of epistemological violence that modernity has involved. I just finished reading this wonderful book called Subject Lessons by Sanjay Seth, The Western Education of Colonial India, and what kind of violence modern education is involved is fascinatingly clear by this book. And yet at the same time, modernity has very deep ambivalences. Sometimes it's possible to think of modernity as this monolithic, powerful machine which rides roughshod over local forms, local variations. And in some ways it has been. But at the same time, and as someone who, like Amita, shares the legacy of the Bengal Renaissance, which is, I think, one of the most important encounters of colonial modernity, we know that this modernity was full of misgivings, idiosyncrasies, self-doubts, many different kinds of, it's not as confident as it sometimes seems from outside. Sometimes it looks like from outside. And I think I'm delighted that we'll be exploring many of these, conflicts, many of these misgivings over this weekend. And I'm especially happy that, English and creative writing, the two departments I'm involved with at Ashoka, are hosting it, the departments where we all inhabit as lives as scholars, as practitioners, as artists, as thinkers, and as the center delightfully, brings up that it's really, that we don't really believe in any kind of abiding distinction between the two. The Center for the Critical and Creative is where this comes from. So with that in mind, I really think there's no better theme to examine these ambivalences than modernity. And I'd love to, hear the opening talk by Parthamitter